Okay, so we've missed a whole lot of Shiurim. We've missed pretty much, last week we covered my trip, which went from Parshas Vayechi, which was the last Sedra in Bereshis, all the way through to Yisro, which was last week's Parsha. This week's Parsha is Mishpatim. And so what I want to do is, we are now exactly halfway through the book of Shmos, Exodus. And so do a overview, summary of what this book of Exodus is about. Why is it called Exodus? Why is it called Shmos in Hebrew? The two don't correlate. And then just see where we're at. What does the whole book discuss? So first up, we call it the book of Shmos because the first Parsha is called Shmos. Shmos means names. So the book starts, Va'elu Shmos. These are the names. Now, whenever have you heard a book with a word, in grade 2, your English teacher said you never start a sentence with the word and. No. And here Hashem starts the whole book of Shmos with the word and. In fact, this week's Parsha starts with the same word, Va'elu. And so when you have the word and, it kind of, you don't have a vav there, it links you back to what you'd previously learned. And so the commentators differ in how the book of Shmos, what does it mean? Why is it called the book of Shmos? So some of the commentators say, well, the book of Bereshis, of Genesis, was really about the establishment of the beginnings of the Jewish people. But we've got an end point. We've got to get to the point where we actually are established as a nation, where Hashem rests within the Jewish people. He's chosen us as his people, and that is the whole book of Shmos. Because the book of Shmos says, Va'elu Shmos, and these are the names. Oh, these are the 12 tribes, the 12 brothers who came down to Egypt. They lived in Egypt. They all died. They were enslaved. And that really is Parshas Shmos, Parshas Bo. Parshas Bo and Va'era. Partway through Va'era, we suddenly have the beginning of the plagues, the first 7 plagues. Parshas Bo, we have the next 3 plagues. And the Exodus from Egypt. So the word Exodus that's used coming from the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation for this book, became into the English vernacular as Exodus. It's really about those first 3 parshas. The word Shmos, well, that's about the first 5 verses in the whole book. But the whole thing is about that. Let's connect, according to Ramban anyway, let's connect what we learnt in Bereshis. Let's go through into Shmos. Right, what happened to Yaakov and his sons, the 70 people who came down to Egypt? They came down to Egypt. They flourished there. They all died. At least that generation of the 12 tribes died. A new Paro came about. The Rashi and others discuss, was it actually a new Paro or was it just Paro forgot who Yosef was? He enslaved the Jewish people. Moshe is born. Moshe grows up. He disappears. For most of his life, actually, he was not in Egypt, at least according to the Medrash, where he left Egypt. He killed the Egyptian, as we all know, when he was a teenager. The next day, he sees 2 Jews fighting. He says, they say, well, you're going to go and kill us like you killed the Egyptian. Oh, there's Lashon Hara amongst the Jewish people. Gets out, because now Paro wants to kill him because he killed the Egyptian. He's a teenager, about, let's say, 16. He runs away. The Medrash brings a whole lot of things, what happened to Moshe, but he landed up being a leader, a king in Africa, probably in Ethiopia or somewhere around there for many, many decades. He then comes back and he lands up in Yisro's house, who becomes his father-in-law when he marries Zipporah. He then, an interesting aside, we all know the story of Arthur and the sword that he pulled out. Well, that comes from a Medrash, Excalibur. That comes from a Medrash. The staff that Hashem had given Adam HaRishon, which had been passed down all the way through, landed up in Yisro's domain. And Yisro planted in the ground. And there was this tradition that the person who pulled this staff out of the soil, out of the rock, will be the redeemer of the Jewish people. Moshe comes to Yisro and he pulls it out. That's where most of Aesop's fables and all of these things come from our sources, from Midrashim, from Gemorahs and various other places. There's one aside. So Moshe is now 80 years old or 79 years old, and he comes back to Egypt. Hashem sees him, calls him at the burning bush, sends him back to Egypt. He's the leader of the Jewish people. When Moshe was born, his parents gave him the name? No one? Tuvia. Tov, he was good. Because the Torah says there, I won't go into the verses, but it says that there was a light. There was an incredible light which was good. And that's where we learn out that his parents gave him the name Tuvia. His adoptive mother, Basia, the daughter of Paro, gave him the name Moshe because it means she withdrew him from the water. That's all brought in the beginning of Shmos. They knew because there was this incredible light. He was born 3 months premature. There was a light that came in. They knew he was going to be the leader of the Jewish people, but then he disappears. Goes into the palace first, from once he's weaned till he's a teenager, then disappears till he's 80. He comes back to redeem the Jewish people. Jewish people we go through the plagues, and we are now redeemed from Egypt. That's Parshas Bo. Parshas B'Shalach is essentially the crossing of the sea and the incredible miracles that happened when we went through the sea and the Egyptians drowned. The Jewish people get out of Egypt now completely. That's really, if you think about the word Exodus, once we have gone through the sea, we're now at the point where we've seen the Egyptians dead on the shore. It says not one of them survived. There is an ancient source, Midrash or Gemara, or even possibly both, that says Paro was the one that survived. He was the only one that survived. And in fact, there's a whole story that he went to Nineveh, the whole story of Jonah and the fish, not a whale. It doesn't mention a whale anyway. We have in our mind Jonah the whale was a big fish. It says a dug. It doesn't say anything about a whale. That Paro was the leader of Nineveh to show that we can all do teshuvah. We can all, it doesn't matter who we are, where we are in our lives, we all have the ability to come back to Hashem. That's another aside. There are lots of little asides here. We go through the sea. We then sing the song Az Yashu, which we discussed at the end last week. And then we go towards Mount Sinai. Yisro. But last week's Parsha, last Shabbos, we had Parshas Yisro. Yisro comes, he gives Moshe some advice, he leaves. When that happened is an interesting question, a disagreement between Rashi and Ramban. Did Yisro come before the giving of the Torah, after giving the Torah? Not for now, beyond the scope. But Yisro came and he joined the Jewish people, he converted, and he went back to convert other people. His family stayed, and Yisro's descendants of Yisro became great rabbis and Talmidei Chachamim in the Jewish people. We then have what we call Ma'amad HaSinai, the standing at Mount Sinai, Hashem choosing us as his people and giving us the Torah. That's last week's Parsha, with a few mitzvahs at the end of that. Let's leave this week's Parsha out. Next week's Parsha, and the 4 Parshas that follow are all about the Mishkan. So we have Shmos Va'era Bo about Egypt, the plagues. B'Shalach about the going through the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, Sea of Reeds. Yisro about giving of the Torah. This week's Parshas Mishpatim about laws, we'll come back to. I'm just trying to find the whole list and I can't see one. Truma Tetzaveh about the Mishkan, giving of the Mishkan. Kisisa, a little bit about the golden calf and that little episode, which we'll speak about, please God, in a few weeks' time. More about the Mishkan. And then Vayakov Kudai, all about the Mishkan. Building of the Mishkan. And Hashem's presence rests in the Jewish people at that point in time. That is the end of the Exodus, essentially. So the name Exodus applies to the whole book, because in order for Hashem to take us out of Egypt, take us through the sea, take us to Har Sinai, give us the Torah, he still needs to rest his presence within the Jewish people, and his presence only fully rests within us. Yes, it did at Mount Sinai, because it was the most incredible revelation ever. But once the Mishkan is built, then Hashem's presence rests in the Jewish people completely. It's at that point that we've reached the Exodus. And now we can go into Israel. Now we're ready to go into Israel. It just took us another 39 years. Or even more than that. But essentially that's the background to this whole Sefer. So this is a book about going out of Egypt. It's about us being down in Egypt already, end of Bereshis, till we get out, until Hashem rests his presence in the Mishkan. Now, interestingly enough, over the next 5 weeks, please God, we're going to discuss the Mishkan. Now, how long did this Mishkan last for? In the desert itself, it lasted for 40 years, 39 years. Okay. They then went into Israel. It then had various forms over the next 400 years, 440 odd years, where it was in Noiv and Givon and Shiloh, essentially. The Mishkan was various different guises, but in Shiloh it was there for 369 years. So most of the period it was there, and Gilgal. In other places it was for a few years each. In Shiloh, the Mishkan itself was a building made of stone, with stone walls around it, but covered with skins like the Mishkan itself, which we'll discuss and come back to in the next few weeks, what it was. So we have 4.5 Parshas in the Torah, where the Torah doesn't waste a single word or even a single letter. Every single letter has significance, and Hashem devotes 4.5 whole Parshas to this structure, which itself in the desert only lasted for 4 decades. As a Mishkan, it lasted for another 400 odd years, but then the temple came along. Shlomo Melech built the temple, and the temple is the more permanent version of the Mishkan. And his temple was in Yerushalayim for 410 years. We were then exiled for 70 years. The story of the Megillah of Esther of Purim happened in that period, towards the end of that period. And then the second temple was built, and that lasted 420 years, until it was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, nearly 2,000 years ago. So the Mishkan, as in Shiloh, as in Beis HaMikdash, was around for 1,200 or thereabout, just more than 1,200 years. We haven't had it for 2,000 years. But what we are all davening for is the rebuilding of the temple, the third Beis HaMikdash, because we had 2, permanently in Yerushalayim, because that will be the time when Mashiach comes in. What comes first? How it will happen? Will the temple just come straight down, built from Hashem in Shemayim, or will man have to build it? Well beyond the scope, a lot of discussion amongst all the authorities how that will happen. Different prophecies, different Rishonim, Achronim discuss how the temple, the Beis HaMikdash, the third temple is going to be built. What is this temple? And how does it have relevance to our lives? Because, as I said, Hashem rested his presence in the temple, or in the Mishkan first, in the Beis HaMikdash, in the first temple particularly, in the second temple to a lesser degree, but you could sense Hashem's presence. It says in Pirkei Avos, in Ethics of the Fathers, in the Mishnah, that there were 10 miracles, constant miracles that happened in the temple. People knew that Hashem was there all the time. You just went there and you knew that Hashem was there. I'll just quickly look at that. Just give me a moment. The final chapter of Pirkei Avos discusses, and we've discussed some of this before, the 5th chapter discusses numbers. So it says, there were, Hashem created the world with 10 statements, 10 utterances. Come back to that in a moment. Because wherever it says, Vayomer Elokim, Hashem said, that's one of the statements. Hashem said, let there be light, and there was light. Now, the problem we've got with that is, just as an aside again, there are only 9 Vayomers in the whole story of creation. So we learn out the word Bereshis. Hashem actually created creation, created the beginnings of things, time maybe. That's one of the creations. That's the 10 statements. The word Bereshis is one of those. Okay, then it says there were 10 generations from Adam to Noach. until Hashem punished the world with a flood. There were 10 generations from Noach to Avraham. Actually 11, but it's from Noach's son Shem, until Avraham came along and received the reward for all of them. There were 10 tests that Avraham had, 10 miracles that were performed at the sea. 10 miracles performed in Egypt, and 10 at the sea. Hashem brought 10 plagues on the Egyptians. We learn out that there were up 250, a whole thing at the sea, that Pesach Seder night. We discussed how the rabbis interpret that. Just brought in a Mishnah in 2 or 3 lines. Okay, 10 times did we test Hashem in the desert, and a few of those have happened already in the Parshas. 10 miracles were performed for our ancestors in the Beis HaMikdash. No women miscarried because of the smell of the sacrificial meat. Sacrificial meat was so incredible that it elevated a person so much that a woman never had a miscarriage. The meat never became putrid. The Beis HaMikdash, at the end of the day, most of it was a slaughterhouse. There was offerings, there was animals that were slaughtered, they were offered up. Most of the slaughterings were slaughtered animals were eaten. Whether they were eaten by the person who brought it, whether eaten by the Kohanim, various different things. Almost every private offering that was brought was eaten. And so this was a slaughterhouse. It was an open air slaughterhouse. Okay, so no meat became putrid. There was never a fly found there. Like we know you got an animal that's a dead animal on the side of the road, full of flies. The high priest never had an emission. The Mishnah in Yuma goes and discusses what they used to do with the Kohen Gadol the night before, the week before Yom Kippur. Never ever had any seminal emissions. There was never rain that put out the fires on the altar. The altar was outside. Rained in Yerushalayim, but the fires kept going. The wind didn't ever disperse the column. When you have a barbecue and you got smoke, wind comes along, you can feel it. That column just went straight up. No matter what the winds in Yerushalayim are like, and Yerushalayim can be quite windy. Various offerings, there was never a disqualification in the Omer. The 2 loaves brought on Shavuot never had disqualification. People stood crowded together, and this is the most incredible miracle. The Beis HaMikdash, the Mishkan, is the point where Hashem's spirituality, if I can use that word, kisses the physicality of the world. So it's a point where physical and spiritual meet. In fact, in terms of dimensions of the Holy of Holies, it doesn't work. Physically, it can't work because the Aron sat in the Holy of Holies, but it wasn't the right size. It was too big to fit in that space, but it's just beyond space because it's the point where our physical and spiritual link, and that it's totally spiritual. And so it says that the person never had, even though it was cramped and there could have been millions of people in this very small area, person always was able to fully prostrate themselves, lie down completely, with ample space around them. And there was never a problem getting accommodation in Yerushalayim. You wanted a place to stay, there was always a place to stay. Now, Yerushalayim, Old City, is like 1 kilometer square, basically, give or take. The Old City we've got today is not the Old City of First Temple times. Slightly different. The walls are a few hundred, 700-800 years old, I think. If you look at the Kotel itself, and we'll come back to this, but in another week, but that's the outside retaining wall of the Temple Mount. It's not the temple itself. And Hashem said in the prophecy, he would leave some form of his Shekhinah, of his presence, in the western wall. And that's why many people go there and feel the holiness. You can feel, that's why it attracts people. That's why until October 7th, whenever you stood there was always somebody taking a photograph of people davening. It's the most irritating thing when you're davening and somebody comes and sticks a camera in your face. Happened this time when we're there, nothing. There's no tourists, at least no non-Jewish tourists, or virtually none. Okay, so that's a synopsis of the whole book of Shmos, of Exodus. I have not mentioned, as far as I recall, mitzvahs. Are there any mitzvahs in this book, in the whole book of Shmos? Are there any mitzvahs? Yeah, there are. 111 actually. Yeah. So there were 3 in the book of, this is according to the Chinuch. Sefer Chinuch brings this order. Others order it slightly differently in different places, but there are 3 in the book of Bereshis. Adam HaRishon was told to be fruitful and multiply. In Lech Lecha, Avram Avinu is given the mitzvah of bris milah, and in Vayishlach, Yaakov has the fight with the angel, and his thigh is injured. We're told we're not allowed to eat the sinew of the thigh, which is why we don't eat the hind quarter of meat today, unless we can take out that whole, yes, veins, sinews, etc. So yes, so in Israel you can get hind quarters,
yes,
because they've got people who are knowledgeable in that. The rest of the world is just easier to sell off the hind quarter and not have to worry about that. The additional cost of that meat would be prohibitive.
What they call it,
Treber in Yiddish, yes. And so, I mean, if you just think about this week's Parsha does have a mitzvah of meat and milk in it. Okay, so kosher meat is not kosher meat there. But one of the reasons why it's so expensive is because we need to check every single stage. It needs to be, we've got to make sure that what we're putting into our body is good for us, for spiritually. And therefore, yeah, we have to pay a little bit more. Hashem handles all of that money for us anyway. Sorry? I wouldn't know what other things cost. I don't care. It doesn't cost me anything.
Yeah, but also a fair amount of kosher meat's basically wasted.
It's not wasted.
Well,
It's sold. It's sold off.
Cheaper.
No, it wouldn't be. It's sold off.
Who's it sold to?
To
No, so that we in an abattoir here, we slaughter the animal, we take the front half, and we sell the back half.
And they sell it to the other
Yeah.
wholesalers.
Okay. So then we get to the book of Shmos, and I said there's 111 mitzvahs.
Sure.
Of those 111, 56 of them are in this week's Parsha. So half of them, basically. 56 being about 8% of all of the mitzvahs. So it's a fair chunk in this week's Parsha. And it's sandwiched right in the middle of the whole book. Just quickly to go through the others, in Parshas Shmos, there aren't any. In Bo, there are 20. And most of that's about the Pesach sacrifice. The very first mitzvah given to the Jewish people in Parshas Bo was Rosh Chodesh. The mitzvah, and the important Rosh Chodesh is this week on Friday and Shabbos. The Friday, Shabbos, Thursday night it starts. The very first mitzvah given to the Jewish people as a people is Rosh Chodesh. And that, in many ways, differentiates us from the rest of the world. Because we have a lunar calendar. Yes, others have a lunar calendar. Muslims have a lunar calendar. The Chinese have a lunar calendar. But their lunar calendars, Chinese is close-ish to us to some degree, but it's really only for their New Year. Which, if you notice, Chinese New Year always falls out on Rosh Chodesh around January or February. Because they adjust it. It's sometimes not adjusted in the same way as ours because of the way our leap years work. Generally it is. The Muslims is a pure lunar calendar. And so if you look at their holidays, their Ramadan, it goes back. It's around 11 days every year. So in 3 years' time, Ramadan, let's just say this year it's in late summer. In 3 years' time, it's going to be in autumn. And 3 years after that, it's going to be in winter. And it keeps going back. Whereas we've got a dual calendar. We've got a lunar calendar, which is adjusted for the seasons. Because Pesach has to be in the month of Aviv. Aviv we translate as spring. Aviv means the time of the barley. Something happens in the barley where the barley ripens or is ready to harvest. That word is about barley. And so springtime, Pesach has to be. So if we're going back 11 days, Pesach this year would have been in early March, which is too early, not springtime yet. The barley hasn't ripened yet. Because the Omer offering which we bring on Pesach is a barley offering. If the barley is not ripe yet, you can't have Pesach. And so we have a 19-year cycle whereby within 19 years we get back to the same point where we were at the beginning, with Pesach always in spring, Sukkot always in autumn, Northern Hemisphere. We obviously flipped. And so that calendar is the most important thing for the establishment of the Jewish people on day one. So Moshe is given the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh in early times until 1700 years ago. The Rosh Chodesh was decided by the Sanhedrin. The highest court in Yerushalayim would decide after Yerushalayim went to Yavne and various other places, after the temple was destroyed, but they would decide, have witnesses seen the new moon? When is the new moon? And they would declare Rosh Chodesh. It was upon them to decide if they needed to add an extra month or not. We now have a formula. It's a pretty simple formula. Every third year approximately is Rosh Chodesh. But I said it's a 19-year cycle, so it doesn't really work.
No.
So the formula is 332, 3332.
If you say so.
Okay, so it's quite simple. No, it's quite simple. We have a second Adar. We about to have Rosh Chodesh Adar Rishon this month. We have Adar Sheni after 3 years, and then after 2 years, and then 3332. That all adds up to 19. And so we are now in the 8th year of the cycle, if you really want to know, as far as I recall. And so that's established with Jewish people. So we have Rosh Chodesh, and then we have all the mitzvahs about the Pesach offering, essentially, and going out of Egypt in Parshas Bo. Parshas Beshalach has got one mitzvah, because in Beshalach we were given a few things. We were given the mitzvah of Shabbos. And therefore we're told, interestingly enough, the first mitzvah that we're told about Shabbos is that there is a boundary as far, you can't go beyond the boundary. Doesn't apply in a city like Melbourne. You can walk to the outskirts of Melbourne, you'll be walking from now until after Shabbos, you might get there. So, but if you're in a small town, which is very relevant, there's only a certain distance, the distance is 2,000 amas, approximately a kilometer, about 900 meters according to most opinions, that you can go beyond the last house of that town. So that mitzvah was given to us then. It's interesting that we were so many things on Shabbos. That's not something that most people would think about. We think about when we go away. That's the only time we work out, okay, where can we go for a walk? Can't just walk for 3 hours on a Shabbos. You can walk up and down and up and down and up and down, but not more than 2,000 amas, 1 kilometer approximately beyond the boundary of where you are. And then we come to Parshas Yisro. Now, the other things that were given in Beshalach was the man. We were given man at that point in time, and water from the rock, and that all happened at that point, before we got to Mount Sinai. We get to Mount Sinai, Parshas Yisro, and Yisro has got 16 mitzvahs in it, mostly around the Aseret HaDibros. Now, I'm not translating Aseret HaDibros as 10 Commandments. Yes, we do translate it in a lot of our works as 10 Commandments. That comes from the King James Version of the Christian Bible. Aseret HaDibrot. A dever, dibur is to speak. Dever is glue as well. It's a thing. But dibur is to speak. Sorry, devet is glue, wrong word. The 10 statements or utterances or words, literally words that Hashem said. There are more than 10 words, obviously, but those 10 are not the big 10 commandments. There are 10 things that Hashem said to us, which are included in the Aseret HaDibros, which are included on the tablets. But there's a dispute in the Gemara. Should we include the Aseret HaDibros in our regular morning davening? Because we include the Shema, we include other things. Why don't we include the 10 Commandments in our morning davening? Because the rabbis didn't want to elevate those mitzvahs above every other one. Because we got 613 mitzvahs. And how do we know which one's more important than the other? So we don't. And so therefore we don't include it in our davening. Now at the end of Shachris there's a whole lot of additional things there that some people say, many people say, some don't. There's 6 remembrances, 6 things we remember. We remember the Exodus from Egypt. We remember the receiving of the Torah on Har Sinai. We remember that Amalek attacked us and we need to wipe out Amalek. We remember the golden calf. We remember what Miriam said. Miriam spoke Lashon Hora about Moshe, reminding us ourselves, watch how we speak. So at the end of Shachris, every day we think, okay, I must remember how to speak and remember Shabbos, as Lorraine said. Then we have the 13 principles of faith, Animamins from Rambam, that are mentioned. The most famous one that everybody sings is about Mashiach, which the one song that everybody at every kind of wedding jumps up and dances about. If only we stopped and thought, hang on, what are we actually jumping up and down for? Because I will guarantee 99.99% of people who jump up and down at weddings are not thinking about Mashiach when they're dancing at that point in time. And yet, that's about Mashiach. And what are we doing to bring Mashiach? The next thing brought in the Seder after Shachris, this is, what do they call it here? Readings following Shachris. The Aseres HaDibros. Now, ArtScroll does translate as the Ten Commandments. I can't argue with ArtScroll. Who am I? But, okay. I'll just see what it says here. Here we go. During the temple era, the Ten Commandments, Aseres HaDibros, were recited as part of the Shema service each morning. Later, certain heretics denied the validity of the rest of the Torah, but accepted only those Aseres HaDibros as a word of Hashem. To prove their point, they cited that the Aseres HaDibros were recited each day, while the rest of the Torah was not. To counteract their claim, the Talmudic sages, it's the Gemara in Brachos on 12a, if anyone wants to look, removed it from formal public prayer service and forbade their reinsertion into the service or their recitation in any public forum except where they appear in the course of the regular Torah reading. So on Shabbos, we read the Aseres HaDibros. That's part of it. On Shavuot, we'll read it again. Moreover, even an individual may not recite them as part of a formal service. Nevertheless, an individual may, and according to some authorities, should recite them either before or after his regular prayers. We don't elevate them because, for the reason given there, is there were heretics who said, well, that was all that Hashem said at Sinai. The rest of it is not the Torah. There's Torah of Aseres HaDibros and Zehu. That's it. Now, we know that we were given two parts to the Torah Shebaal Peh and the Torah Shebiksav. Torah Shebiksav is the 5 books of Moses, let's call it, sitting in the written Torah in the Aron Kodesh. The Torah Shebaal Peh is the oral Torah that was handed down, that Moshe taught everybody. Moshe taught to Aaron, to the elders, to all the people. Each thing was taught 4 times. And that oral Torah that was handed down from teacher to student, from parent to child, for thousands of years, still till today. At the time, after the destruction of the second temple, the Tanoim were the rabbis of the time, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, we call him Rebbe, and his students and the rabbis decided that we needed to write down the Torah, the oral Torah. So they wrote down what we have as Mishnah. Short, abbreviated statements to explain some of the Torah. A few hundred years later, we went further and further away, and so therefore they wrote down what we call the Gemara. The Gemara is the Talmud, which is made up of the Mishnah, and explanations of the Mishnah being the Gemara part of it. And so that is the oral Torah, plus every other book that we've got written, plus every shir, plus everything else, all adds up to be what we call Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah. But all of that was given by Hashem to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai. Not necessarily in the exact form that we have it, because what was given was a way of understanding how to apply laws. And that's what happens today. How do we know we are not allowed to use electricity on Shabbos, switch on electricity? We can use it in permitted ways. How do we know electricity is a problem? Because we've got methods of learning out. The Torah says X, Y, Z. We use this verse to explain it with that word, and we can connect various things, and through various different tools that were given on Mount Sinai, we are able to extrapolate the actual halacha that we have. What the rabbis also did was put various different fences, we call it, around the Torah to protect us not to do something completely wrong. So a lot of what we do, and most of the discussion in the Gemara, is around that. It's not around the main things. It's not around the actual halachas. The 613 mitzvahs are what they are. Yeah, there's a bit of discussion which actually fits in amongst the Rishonim. There's some discussion as to what is actually the 613. Is something above a mitzvah, or is it actual mitzvah? Believing in Hashem, for example. Is that a mitzvah, or is it something that overrides the entire Torah, entire life? That's beyond this discussion. But the essence of Torah is not up for discussion. That's what we were given. The sidelines, all the disputes in the Gemara is full of disputes. It's all about the rabbinic institutions. How do we apply it? How do we learn it? What do we do with it? The actual Torah is Zehu. That's it. It's a fait accompli. That's what we were given. And so what is this Parshas Mishpatim that pops up right in the middle of this book of Shmos? Because we've got the beginning part, which is Egypt, leaving Egypt, going through the sea, getting to Mount Sinai. We've got the end part, so 5 in the beginning. We've got 5 at the end, essentially all about the Mishkan, with a little bit about the golden calf. And right in the middle, we've got this Parshas Mishpatim. It's got 56 mitzvahs in it, thrown in between. Essentially straight after Aseret HaDibros, we told the 10 statements, and then we told, here's Mishpatim. Now, what are Mishpatim? There's 3 kinds of mitzvahs. Chukim, Mishpatim, and Eidos. Chukim are those things we don't understand. The ultimate chok, we've got Parshas Chukas, is the red heifer. How is it possible that we get this purely red animal, a cow, that we burn its ashes, mix together with water, throw it on somebody, that person becomes purified from having come in contact with a dead person, but the person sprinkling them becomes impure. We don't understand. King Solomon said that is beyond him. He was the wisest of all men, and he said that is the ultimate chok. He couldn't understand that. That's a chok. Now, every mitzvah really is a chok, something that we don't know the reasons for. We try and understand some of the reasons. Some of the rabbis will bring reasons for things. Sometimes the Torah does bring a reason. Many of our mitzvahs, and we'll please God discuss this when we discuss Shabbos shortly, are around going out of Egypt. We do this because Hashem took us out of Egypt. So that's a reason. But most mitzvahs are not. Eidos are those type of things, those testimonies where we can testify to something. Mishpatim is essentially civil law. So we have here, right in the middle of the book of Shmos, these 56 laws, mostly related to civil law. And the very first one comes along. In fact, if you look didn't take out Chumashim for everybody, but ArtScroll brings their little introduction, Parshas Mishpatim, the civil law. And it says the juxtaposition of this Sedra dealing primarily with civil and tort law, with Aseret HaDibros and the laws of the altar, because after the Aseret HaDibros, after the Torah is given, right at the end of Parshas Yisro, it brings the law of the Mizbeach, of the altar. Provide a startling insight into Judaism. To God, there is no realm of religion, in quotes, in the colloquial sense of the word. Most people think of religion as a matter of ritual and spirituality. Western man differentiates between church and state. The Torah knows no such distinction. To the contrary, all areas of life are intertwined, and holiness derived from halachically correct business dealings, no less than from piety in matters of ritual. The sages teach that one who wishes to be a chassid, not chassidim as in our times per se, a devoutly pious person, hopefully chassidim are that, but somebody that wants to be a chassid should be scrupulous in matters of civil and tort law. That's a Gemara in Bava Kama. For in Judaism, the concept of the temple is in the courtroom as well as in the synagogue. This is significant. This is the significance of juxtaposition of these chapters. So in other words, every Jewish halacha, how we deal man with man, how we deal man with Hashem, and how we deal man with ourselves, man being mankind, is on the same playing field. We're all the mitzvahs are mitzvahs that Hashem gave us that we need to do. So how we connect to another human being is just as important as how we connect to Hashem. And that's what is being brought here. So I said at the beginning, Shmos starts Va'elu Shmos, Mishpatim start Va'elu HaMishpatim. And these are the ordinances, laws. Va'elu, and these are, meaning go back to last week's Parsha, this is a direct continuation. This was taught from Hashem to the Jewish people through Moshe on Mount Sinai. This is what's important. And the very first law that's brought is slavery. Jewish slaves. And that's that doesn't apply to us. Well, it does, because all of us are slaves. Slaves to these things, and slaves to money, and slaves to whatever else. We're all slaves. But a Jewish slave is a person who did something wrong, and they need to pay back for what they stole, and they couldn't afford it. And therefore they have to become enslaved to the person that they did something wrong to for a period of 6 years. And in the 7th year they go free. Nothing to do with Shemitah in 6 and 7 years, that's also here. But a Jewish person, Jewish slave, works for the master. A whole range of things that has to happen, and how in the halacha, in fact, if a person's got, the Gemara brings, if a person's got one pillow, the slave gets a pillow. If he's got a piece of steak and a salad, the slave gets the steak. Because we need to know that we need to treat people properly. Even though this person is enslaved to his master, he needs to be treated with proper respect. There's a whole section about how if a father sells his minor daughter, how she gets treated. Obviously, this doesn't happen in our times. But what happens to her? All to do with slavery. Because Hashem's saying, you were slaves in Egypt. Remember what the Egyptians did to you. Hashem said, let my nation go. We all know that statement. That verse continues. So that they may serve me. We are Hashem's servants. And so we can't forget that Hashem took us out of Egypt in order for us to serve Hashem. Not took us out of Egypt to be free. Because the only person who is free is somebody who serves Hashem. Somebody who doesn't serve Hashem is not free. They are enslaved to society, to their devices, to other people, to whomever, to whatever it is. A person, freedom, the rabbis describe it this way, is freedom is the ability to say no. To say no to those things that my Yetzer Hara wants me to do. To say no to those things that I do it because this is the way I always do it. No, I don't have to do it this way. There's another way. Hashem said, do it this way rather. Let me stop and say, nope, I want to do it better. I want to do it differently. That's a free person. A person who is always freely doing whatever they want to do, whenever they want to do it, is actually enslaved to society, to whatever they're enslaved to. And so that's the real definition of freedom. Let my people go so that they may serve me. It always has to end with that. We forget that. We always think, Moshe went to Paro and said, let my nation go, let my nation go, let my nation go. Hashem said, tell Paro, let my nation go so that they can serve me. That's if we take one thing out of the whole book of Shmois, that's it. Okay, I just want to run very quickly through some of the other mitzvahs. I didn't cover a tenth of what I thought I'd cover in my head, but so be it. Okay. A whole range about slaves. Now, interesting enough, if a Hebrew slave, a Jewish slave, wants to stay with his master, his or her master, he can, forever. Or at least until Yovel, the 50th year. And he has to go to the door of the Beis Din and has to have a hole pierced in his ear to show that he didn't want to be free like Hashem wanted. He wanted to be enslaved.
Why would he have a hippie?
Because he loved life. He loved eating steak as opposed to salads.
Okay.
We can understand sometimes a person might feel that it's actually it's much more comfortable to know every day I've got to do this.
The one you know than the one you're going to meet.
Yeah. Okay. And so there is a parallel. Ramban brings, and I want to look at some of what Ramban brings, but in terms of the way the Aseret Dibros are brought down and connecting it to these mitzvahs. Because the Aseret Dibros are split into the two tablets. The first 5 essentially between man and God. I'm Hashem your God, and I have no other gods before me, keep Shabbos. And the second 5 between man and man. Don't kill, don't steal. Don't steal means don't kidnap, by the way. Again, the Christian church has translated it for wrongly. The word means steal, but there's a separate mitzvah in the Torah, don't steal. There it means don't steal a person. Etc. Don't covet. And Ramban brings down and he connects those 5 into this week's Parsha. But what the 5th of them is on your parents. Now that's on the side of man and God. Most of the commentaries bring down something very simple. Every single child is born through 3 parents. Mother, Father, Hashem. You need all 3 parties in order for a child to be born. I said at the beginning that Hashem kept the keys of, I think before we were recording, the keys of rain. He also keeps the keys of childbirth. When a baby will be born. Yes, we have cesareans. There were cesareans done. Why are they called cesareans? Julius Caesar was the one who was born that way. Yeah. So the Gemara talks a lot about it in animals, in people. It's all over the Gemara here about cesarean birth. And it ties into so many sections in Halacha. But Hashem has that key when a baby will be born. All right, so then it starts talking about the way a court can execute people by strangling them, not for now. It then talks about not to strike a parent. Coming back to kibbut avayim, a person who does certain averos, certain sins, is subject to a death penalty. Striking another person is not subject to a death penalty. It's subject to payments for hurting them, for their loss of work, for needing to go to a doctor, whatever it might be. But if a person strikes a parent, it's subject to a death penalty. That's how severe or how highly elevated parents need to be in the eyes of children. Children need to look at their parents as the connection back to Sinai. Very famous story. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, as far as I recall, was in a plane, sitting next to a very well-known professor in some Israeli university. And the professor's sitting there in business class, and as far as I recall, it was Rabbi Yaakov. And one of his grandchildren were on the plane, Rabbi Yaakov's grandchildren with him. And every so often, the grandchild would come and bring Rabbi Yaakov a drink and help him and do something for him and get another book out for him, whatever he was doing on this very long flight. And the professor turns to Rabbi Yaakov and says to him, Halavai, that my grandchildren should show so much respect for me like yours do. I can hardly even speak to my grandchildren. Rabbi Yaakov said, well, it's true. You're a professor. You believe in evolution. So you believe in Darwin. So your grandchildren see you as two steps closer to a monkey.
Exactly.
My grandchildren see me as steps closer to Moshe Rabbeinu and to Har Sinai. Obviously, they're going to respect me. That's from here.
I love it.
It takes a gadol b'Torah to come up with that. Some great person in Torah would only come up with that.
Yeah.
We couldn't think of those type of answers like
Can I
that.
ask you a question?
Sure, you just did.
Getting back to your cesarean.
Mine? No, I was born naturally.
Okay. Why is a cesarean firstborn son not having a pit in your bed?
Because a firstborn, not only a son, it's animals as well. There's a first Peter Chamor.
Considering
Right, yeah, 100%. So Peter Chamor means opening of the womb. Okay, that's a firstborn. A firstborn is the child who opens the womb. A cesarean doesn't open the womb. The womb is still shut because the child is pulled out from the stomach, so to speak. And so it's a technical thing, really. Going back to, and that again, that's what we learn out. That's the oral Torah teaches us that. Because without it, we would say, yep, firstborn, no problem, put in the bin. So it's because of that definition. It applies exactly the same to firstborn animals. I'm learning the Mishnah Bechoros at the moment about firstborn, and that's where it's brought in there.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Okay, then we talk about fines and penalties. There's 4 capital punishments, 4 ways that a person can be found guilty and subject to a death penalty. Brings another one, decapitation by the sword. Judging animals, a whole range of things about judgments, how judges act, what do they need to do for damages. If somebody digs a pit and an animal falls in, or a person falls and gets injured, how do you do that? How do you judge that? What happens when a person steals? How does a court judge that? What about if there's a fire? Somebody lights a fire which causes damage to another person's property. It's all in the Gemara, all of this in the Gemara of Bava Kama. Mostly about judgment here. Okay, what about sorcerers? If somebody comes along as a sorcerer, as a witch, as a black magician, does black magic, the source of them not being allowed to live comes from here, because they're denying Hashem's existence. They're using negative forces to bring down things which are not acceptable in the Jewish people. Not to oppress a convert. Mitzvah there, don't oppress, don't say wrong things to a convert, don't wrong a convert, don't wrong an orphan and a widow. We need to think about other people. All these mitzvahs are about thinking of other people. What is that person, where are they in their life right now? If I do something to them, will I be wronging them? That affects me completely because I did the wrong thing. We're very careful with our words, the way we say things, the way we do things. Yeah. Don't curse a judge. Judges are there to judge and hand things down in a way that they've learned from the Torah. We're talking about a judge in a Beis Din, not a judge in The court's up the road. Okay. When a judge when a Beis Din hands down their decision, that's a decision, and they hand it down, and that's it. It's a unanimous decision. Even a Beis Din today, if 2-1, let's say there were 3 judges, and they handed down 2-1, they're not going to tell you Judge X said this, Judge Y said that, and Judge Z said something else. No, definitely not. ICJ, yeah, J is the wrong word there, but yeah. They hand it down as a decision. That's what they hand down, and the parties who came to a Beis Din need to walk away from this, and that's the right decision, and that's it. Now, obviously, that's often very hard for a person who loses, but that's the level we need to be at to accept that.
Challenge a Beis Din's judgment.
By a greater Beis Din, potentially, yes. Or if there's an error, if they made a mistake. But generally, Beis Din today is done on an arbitration basis, generally anyway. Okay, mitzvah to take pity on a poor person. Not to take pity on a poor person when making judgments. In other words, don't say, well, he's a rich guy, he's a poor guy, I'm going to take pity on him. No, we need to bring the law out as it is. Judges not to take a bribe. Then I mentioned Shemitah. The mitzvah of Shemitah comes in this year, every 7th year, to leave the land and its produce ownerless. The miracles of Shemitah, I think I mentioned it last week briefly, the miracles that come out of those farmers in Israel who keep Shemitah. It actually says with the mitzvah of Shemitah that if you'll come along and ask, well, what will I eat in the 8th year? Then Hashem will give you enough produce for 3 years. And it's the commentators ask there, well, what does it mean if you will come and ask? What happens if you don't ask? Well, then Hashem will just give it, and you won't have to work the land so hard, because now if you ask the question, it shows less of a trust in Hashem, therefore you're going to have to work a lot harder. If you don't ask the question, you keep Shemitah and you just do it, the next year will be bountiful and you'll just have to work just as normally as you normally would. That's one of the answers given. Mitzvah of resting on Shabbos. Resting doesn't mean that I should sleep for 25 hours. Resting means that I should rest from work. Sleep is part of it, but to say that you slept the whole Shabbos away is a problem. But my opinion, other people disagree with me. Mitzvah of bringing bikurim, first fruits, to the Beis HaMikdash. Mitzvah not to cook meat in milk. Now that's brought 3 times. Lo tevashel gedi b'chalav imoy. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Kid being a kid goat is brought 3 times in Torah. Those words connected to other things always, but it's learned out. Don't cook meat and milk. Don't eat meat and milk, and don't get benefit from meat and milk. Those are the 3 things we learn out from it. And don't settle any idol worship in our land. That's the 94th mitzvah. Okay, so that's Parshas Mishpatim. In the middle of all of this, the rest of the book of Shmos has got 3 mitzvahs in Truma, 7 in Tetzaveh, 9 in Kisisa, and 1 in Vayakel and B'kurei. And that's it. So we've got this huge, half of the mitzvahs in the book of Shmos on this week's Parsha. They take up 8% of all the mitzvahs, and it's just sandwiched in the middle of these kind of major events. But I think the message I take from this is Yetzias Mitzrayim and going out of Egypt and getting the Torah is all about us connecting to Hashem, and us connecting to Hashem with each other, man and man. Because at the end of the day, Hashem looks down on us and says, well, who's the person that Hashem loves? Just look at a person, and if other people love him, and if other people get on with that person, that means Hashem's sitting with that person and likes that person as well. If a person's got problems with everybody and fights with everybody, Hashem's saying, well, it's not the kind of person I necessarily want to associate with. This is not me saying, this is Chazal bring this down. I'm saying it in my words. And so, the message of Mishpatim is we want to bring Mashiach. We want to have the ultimate redemption. We want absolute peace in Eretz Israel. We saw the day we were leaving Israel, we were in the old city, and there was just at the Cardo, which is the Roman main street, just in the middle of the old city, just by the Rava, in the middle of the old city, where you see there's a fence there, and we're eating breakfast and looking at this, and there were a whole lot of paintings on canvases that were for sale. So type of outdoor canvases you'd put up on your sukkah. And both Tamar and I looked at this one painting, and we thought, wow, that's really, really amazing. I'll show it to you now. Printed. I took a photo of it, and I've printed it.
You didn't buy it.
Uh,
Or couldn't buy it.
we couldn't buy it because we didn't have time, and the canvas size we would have liked would have been way too expensive. Okay, so what this is showing a whole range of soldiers davening, and you won't be able to see it, but in here is writing B'yachad nenatzeach. B'yachad. When we're together, when we're one, then we're going to win. Then we're going to be free. The only time we're going to have the ultimate freedom and winning and Hashem sending Mashiach is when we act together. God willing, we're all going to act together.
Unity is strength.